very lucky today to hear from one of the world's great debate educators. It's not an exaggeration to say that anywhere in the world this gentleman has gone, he's been the student's favorite. He's also one of the hardest working guys in debate anywhere. And also, kind of frighteningly enough, he's a really nice guy. Please welcome the director, the coach of the Korean National World Schools team, Peejay Garcia.
Hey folks, good morning. All right, thanks. Remember, for those of you who don't yet know, I'm willing to bribe you to clap a little bit louder and smile a little bit nicer, so just make sure that you talk to me after this talk. Now, basically, our talk today is about analyzing the motion. So, I'm going to be dealing with a number of different issues today, one of which obviously will be telling you the different kinds of motions we have in debate, and then after that, I'm going to be talking to you about how we can strategize, the different techniques that we could have and use these techniques so that we can come up with a really effective case, okay? Based on the elements of these motions that we'll be talking about. So if any of you have any questions at any time, please feel free to ask them. And of course, I believe in a lot of student participation, so I might ask you questions in the middle of this talk, okay? Let's begin. So we've got three different kinds of motions in debate. We have fact motions, value motions, and policy motions. So each of these three motions are listed on the board. They are, however, a bit truncated. I have a handout I'm going to be giving you later which explains them in greater depth, but I will give you a basic idea of what these three are and how we look at motions depending on which motion type the motion that we are given falls under. Okay? Let's start with fact motions. Fact motions are motions which generally have the form of a verb to be. For example, is or are. Like you'll see underneath, we've got some examples. This house believes that Bush is a failure. Okay, now some of you might think that's an absolute fact and not debatable, but in a fact motion debate, what you're going to be doing is looking at a motion like this and saying, okay, what do I know about George Bush? How can I assess what I know about George Bush? And how can I say that he is either a failure, if I'm in proposition, or not a failure, if I'm in opposition? The basic elements of a fact motion are obviously facts, evidence, statistics, anything that you can bring up to talk to people about what the status quo is showing us. But then that's not enough. Because if you tell people certain facts, the facts by themselves don't generally make a conclusion. All right? For example, there was one debate tournament I attended in Australia just shortly after they had elected a known racist to be a member of parliament. And her name was Pauline Hanson. She used to be, I think she was a fish and chips vendor, if I'm not mistaken. But she ran on a platform of racial superiority for the Australian people, and she was promoting policies such as the restriction of immigration for Asian immigrants into Australia, for example. So a lot of people were really upset with her, and yet, for a while at least, she got elected to the Australian Parliament. Now that's a fact. Okay, another fact is, in terms of the total votes, they did a survey, and apparently 13% of Australians at that point, at least for that survey, supported Pauline Hanson. That's another fact. So what do these facts say? What do these facts say? 13% of Australians supported her. She got elected to Parliament. She was a racist.
Australians support racism.
Australians support racism. That's one way of looking at it, right? Because the facts say that a racist was elected to Australian Parliament. And, the idea of a racist getting elected is pretty atrocious for some of us. But we heard a talk from one of the Australian officials at that event. And here's what he had to say. Now, he said, it's a bit shameful, to be honest, that someone like Pauline Hanson could get elected. But I want you to understand that even though 13% of Australians support her, 87% of Australians, the vast majority of Australia reject her. So it's clear that Australia is not a racist country. She's only one among hundreds of members of parliament. Okay? And I want you to all realize that we are very inclusive, we are very welcoming, and in a short period of time we are absolutely certain Pauline Hanson will no longer be a member of parliament because people will come to their senses. And he was absolutely right. Shortly thereafter, she was not re-elected into parliament. So he used the same statistic, 13%, obviously meaning the other side would be 87%, and he twisted it around and said, look, our interpretation of this is that she's not a racist. So with this example, you can pretty much see a fact or statistic, anything can be, I don't know if the word twisted is the right word, can be used to defend a particular position. So in a fact motion, you're going to be asked to assess whether something is or is not something else. You're going to be asked to make a conclusion. If you're in proposition, for example, this House believes that Bush is a failure, you're going to be asked to say, look, present some facts, get some statistics, show us that George W. Bush is a failure. Of course, the opposition will be saying, wait, we're looking at the same facts, or we have other facts that show that he is not a failure. But is this pretty straightforward? I mean, what does the word failure mean? What does the word failure mean?
Did not did his job as he should.
Did not do his job? That's one way. Is there any other interpretation of failure? Helen?
Well, displease your populace.
Sorry?
Well, if you don't appease your populace.
Don't appease your populace, so he's really unpopular, maybe? Anything else? Any other interpretation?
It could be a failure in terms of a certain thing.
Okay, could be in terms of a policy, could be in terms of his ideals, it could be in terms of his character. There are many ways that we can say something means something else. And that's one of the things you have to understand about fact motions. In a motion of fact, where you're asked to assess, for example, this House believes that the United Nations, is a success. Okay, the words failure and success, when we start defining these words, they still need a little bit of an interpretation. We still need what we call a standard for judging what is right or wrong, what is good or bad. And this word standard is going to be common throughout all these three types of motions. I'm going to talk about them a bit later. Okay? So, how then do we come up with a standard? Well, here's the formula. Each of these things have equations that I've written down beside them. Okay? In a fact motion, the equation is facts plus interpretation equals conclusion. So whatever set of facts you have, whatever the status quo is showing you, you still have to have your own interpretation of what these facts mean. And this is where a lot of the debate strategy comes in. If you're in proposition, you have to tell yourself, first of all, what is my standard for failure? And secondly, what do the facts tell me about whether George W. Bush is or isn't a failure? Do the facts support my conclusion? And in order to support the conclusion, you need this standard or set of criteria by which you can judge a particular fact. Like, some of you probably remember when you were young and your parents were encouraging you to do your homework, maybe paint something for art class or do something else. And when we're really young, like we're 2 years old, for example, no matter what we put on paper, what do our parents say?
Oh, nice.
Oh, it's so beautiful! Oh, you keep Peejay, look at what you did, right? Right? But then, when we're 18, and we do the same squiggly line we did when we were 2 years old, our parents are going to go, is that your art project? How do you expect to pass? Right? Or is this math? What are you doing? Like, when we're young, Mommy, 1 + 1 = 5. And what does your mom say?
Yay.
Yay! Well, not quite, PJ, but good try, right? Right? But you're in college, you say 1 + 1 = 5, Mom. Your mom's gonna, you stupid idiot. This is what I paid college to do for you, right? So the idea is we have a different standard for judging what our young brothers and sisters or cousins or children do, depending on at what stage of life they're in. So even if they do the exact same thing, it means something different to us because we look at them in a different way, right? The same thing works in fact motions. Like, you can say the United Nations is a failure because our standard for judging success or failure is whether or not the United Nations has met its original purpose. Right? And if its original purpose, for example, was to never again see a genocide in the world today, then they failed in the case of Rwanda. Okay, that's an example. So you are giving facts, you are setting standards, you are creating an interpretation, and then you lead to a conclusion. Okay? Any questions? Yes, Mary.
So like if you're rebutting interpretation that the other side has made, you
Yep.
would be using maybe the same facts or other facts and interpreting it your way.
I'll give you a very good example, okay? Iraq. A lot of people are arguing about whether or not the United States did the right thing by Iraq, right? What do the opponents of George W. Bush say in terms of Iraq?
We had no reason to go in.
No reason to go in?
There.
Okay?
People are dying without a reason.
People are dying, right? Especially innocent Iraqi civilians. Anything else?
That we serve no purpose there anymore.
No,
That the
no
United,
purpose.
uh,
Illegitimate.
Patronizing.
There were no weapons of mass destruction. All these things, right? Right. Now, what does Bush say? Yes, ma'am.
That we removed the evil dictator.
We removed an evil dictator, Saddam Hussein, and it was good for the Iraqi people. What else?
War on terrorism.
Sorry?
War on terrorism.
There was a war on terror. It was necessary to prevent Iraq from supporting terrorism. Anthony?
We're giving them democracy.
Giving them democracy. Democracy is so important, right? So you have all of these things. Yeah, I can see Tim the way you're he has very strong feelings about Iraq. But obviously, we're looking at the exact same thing. We're looking at the exact same event, but different people have a different way of looking at that event. So if you have a motion like this House believes that the United States invasion of Iraq was a good thing, obviously on one side you can talk about an interpretation of good because it's democratic, because you removed an evil dictator, because you've given them hope for freedom, because you've given them the right to vote, all these things. And if you say it's a bad thing, then for all the reasons that everybody, including Tim, can obviously bring out, you say those things and you therefore assess it in that way. That's a fact debate. Any questions? All right. Now, the thing is, in world schools, fact debates are not the most common types of debates. You'll probably see these next two as being a little bit more common. Okay, so let's look at the second one, for instance. This is a value debate. Now, a value debate is when you're asked to assess what something is worth to a particular target group. Okay? For example, this house supports affirmative action. Now, the word affirmative action, it's obviously it's a policy, true enough, but this is not a debate about a particular policy and exactly what we're going to be doing with affirmative action. This is a debate about whether we support or believe in this idea of affirmative action. And if you support or believe in it, you generally do it because you believe in the principle behind it. Right? What is affirmative action, folks?
positive discrimination.
Positive discrimination.
Quotas in schools.
Quotas in schools for what purpose?
Gender, race.
Gender.
To equalize the number of
Okay.
people.
Fair enough. To equalize things in society. Because like you said, because you have gender, race inequalities in society, right? So in some cases, you might need to help them a little bit. Because for example, in the case of the civil rights movement in America, you have centuries of inequality. And because of those centuries of inequality, it can be argued that certain races in America are not on the same level playing field. So it's right for the government to do this. It is just for the government to support something like this. And that's the whole idea behind a value debate. You are attacking, defending, supporting something on the basis of principles and values. They can be ethical values, moral values. They could be values related to human life, rights, etc., etc. But the basic idea is you have opposing values on either side of the debate. Now, it sounds pretty good, right? Helping people get over their inequalities. But what about the opposite side? If you're in opposition in this debate, are you automatically going to lose because you're the bad guy? What possible values could the opposition have for this debate?
True equality.
Sorry?
True equality. Every discrimination is still discrimination.
Okay, it's discrimination. Even if it's positive discrimination, it's still discrimination. Anything else? Think about it for a second. Anything else?
Based on merit, not race.
Hey, it should be based on merit because this is still racial discrimination. Whether you think it's good or not, it's still racial discrimination. What else?
We're patronizing the minority.
Okay, you're patronizing minority. You're basically telling minority, look, we know you're really stupid, so we'll help you out a little bit because you're too dumb to do it on your own. Something like that. That's what the opposition might be saying, right? And they say that's the wrong thing. Obviously, it's an insult to the minority. The minority groups are much smarter than that. They're much more capable than that. So obviously, we shouldn't be doing this kind of patronizing. Anything else? Yes, Sharma.
That you're excited with discrimination because you get kind of, other people put down the secondary because they think they're getting more help than necessary.
Okay, you have certain social consequences. People have this cycle of discrimination. For example, if, a young lady is given a job based on positive discrimination laws because of gender inequality, people in the office might go, you only got that job because you're a woman. So, if I'm in opposition, I might say, look, the value that is most important to these people is social respect. And if you're talking about positive discrimination to try to fix inequalities, we say that the source of inequality is a lack of respect for these kinds of people. So pushing this kind of positive discrimination isn't going to fix the source of that inequality because people are going to resent them, people are not going to respect them, in general, and even they themselves won't be able to really hold their heads up high and say, we achieved this on our own. This is exactly what we are capable of doing, because there's always going to be this nagging doubt that maybe they did it because of the law. Right? And so you'll see the standard for deciding in a value motion is basically assessing what something is worth to a particular target group. The equation I wrote here is principal plus target equals worth. You can't assess a value unless you know for whom this value is meant. Okay, so for example, like we said, positive discrimination, it's to correct inequalities. So basically the idea of affirmative action is it's good for the minority group we're trying to help. And I'm going to use the same sort of standard. I'm going to say in opposition, yes, that principle is fine, except respect is more important. And if you want respect, for this group especially, you can't do affirmative action. Because whatever they get in the end, it's not what they really need. Okay? It's not worthwhile for these folks because they get that kind of resentment, etc., etc. You understand about value? Okay, let me add one more thing about value motions. What if you have opposing values that just both sound really good? They just sound really good. How do you decide? Because one side, might be easier than the other. How do you decide when one thing is good or not? One thing is better than another value or not. Anybody? Any ideas?
And what is it? What is it?
Like the right to privacy is more important than the public right to know.
Yes.
There are two.
A debate like that.
You have two.
Privacy rights versus social good. Or in the case of racial profiling, okay? Some people are questioning, I went through immigration in the US, so. In terms of racial profiling, people are accusing, it's not admitted, but people are accusing authorities here in America of targeting certain racial groups. Like if I'm a Saudi Arabian man who just came from Afghanistan and I'm flying in through New York, trust me, I'm gonna be watched a little bit more closely, right? And if I were a British gent who only came from London and never went anywhere else in the world. Okay? And that would be, people would say, a violation of rights. Racial profiling is a violation of rights in some cases. But at the same time, as Boyano was saying, you would have a certain social good. People are saying, but still, recent terrorist attacks seem to indicate that a certain racial type does do those attacks more than other groups. So it just makes more sense for us to investigate these groups for the safety of the community, right? So what do you do then? You have individual rights, and you have the safety of the community. How do you decide?
Who benefits more?
Who benefits more?
Well, like which right? The rights of the many versus the rights of few.
Yeah, but then if you use that standard, the rights of many will always win. In which case you're supporting utilitarianism. I mean, slavery would be justified under that model, right? What else? Anybody?
Which right brings in better consequences?
Pardon me?
The consequences.
Okay, consequences, which are better consequences, but I guess both sides would say our consequences are good. On the one hand, we're protecting civil liberties, and that's vital in a democracy, right? On the other hand, you're saying, but we're protecting the safety of the community. Health and safety is vital in any government, never mind a democracy. So what I'm trying to point out is this. In value debates, it's going to get a little bit shaky if you don't have a good standard for deciding what value is higher than the other. That's why it's so important, first of all, to identify the clear target group that you're trying to help. If you just say, oh, in general, the world, it might be a bit too generic. You need to be a bit more specific. Because a lot of different policies, especially social policies, where they try to change attitudes or where they try to help a particular group, for instance, these policies can only really be assessed to be worth more or less if you understand the real needs of the target group, if you understand what is really going to be beneficial for the target group, and only then can you really see if something is worth more than the other. For example, I'll just give you some standard arguments, okay? In that argument about racial profiling, the proposition that says we should ban racial profiling will talk about individual rights, civil liberties. They'll say, what use is protecting a society if we destroy the very foundation of that society itself? The very rights that we're claiming we are affirming in a democracy are destroyed by this policy. So in the end, you're protecting a fascist state. You are destroying liberty, and that is so critical to every human being. That's what they're going to be saying, okay? They're focusing on the civil liberties, they're talking about democracies, they're talking about what is essential to a democracy, and that's why their value is stronger. Anybody want to try the opposition? What do you think? How do you think we can make that strong? We already talked about civil liberties. How do you think social good or the protection of the state would be more valuable for the opposition?
What good is a foundation if everybody that has to live in the house is scared to death?
Okay, so fear is so dangerous to a society. And if we can't even guarantee that our little children can walk to school safely, we can't even guarantee that the innocent civilians under our care are protected, what kind of a government are we? Because the most critical role of any government, the most important role, is to protect its citizens. And if we can't protect our citizens, if somehow, some way, because we are so worried about certain civil liberties, we forget about human life, then we're really not the kind of society we want to be. Right? That's an example of how you explain these things. And you're doing it using, again, the standard with the target group. I see you smiling, Tim. Any questions? All right. So that's an example of value motions. Does anyone want to ask anything at this stage? Okay. Now, the third type of motion is a bit interesting because a lot of world schools type motions are policy motions, including the prepared motion we have for today, okay, which I've written down here as the third example. Policy motions are motions basically call for a certain action, or in the case of the opposition, inaction, or perhaps alternative action. We'll talk about that in a bit. And how do you decide what a society should or shouldn't do, or what a target group should or should not do? Because that's generally the key terms that you see. If you see a motion that says should or would, in general in world schools, that's called a change debate, where you're asking people to change the status quo, where you're asking people to somehow do something different. So why should we do something different? All right, now I've written the equation here. Need plus plan plus benefits equals action. Now what does that mean exactly? Let's take it step by step. In a policy debate, for instance, this House believes that hate speech should be a crime. The key question is, why? What exactly is the need for this particular policy? Why should we make something a crime? And if we can't establish any need, if we can't prove to people that there's some real legitimate reason for this, there's no point changing the status quo, right? Like if you have a policy that's pretty ridiculous, this House believes that everybody should swallow toothpicks in the morning. You're like, why? What is the need to swallow toothpaste? Because we can. You know? I mean, have you heard about Sir Edmund Hillary, the gentleman who climbed Mount Everest? I'm not sure if this is entirely true, but there was a legend attributed to him about how when someone asked him, why did you climb Mount Everest? And the answer was, because it was there. That sounds pretty adventurous, right? Pretty manly, because it was there, right? But in debate, you don't do that. Why should we swallow toothpicks in the morning? Because we can. It doesn't make any sense. There's always got to be a particular need. But if you're going to have a need, you have to ask yourself, which group is needing this thing exactly? Okay? So, in this case, hate speech. All right? I'm going to ask you guys to participate, and this is important because you're going to have a debate this afternoon. Okay? What's your idea of hate speech? Anybody?
Against certain races.
Sorry?
Speech against certain races.
Okay, speech targeted against certain races. Helen?
It's derogatory, like to invoke a certain emotion.
Okay, derogatory, meant to invoke emotion, including hatred, which is why it's called hate speech. Anthony?
Words that threaten a certain group.
I'm sorry?
Words that threaten a certain group.
Threaten a certain group, yes. I mean, if you say bad things, which, because I'm being video cameraed, so I'm not going to say anything, but if you say against a particular group, right, and the group goes, when you say that, in general, it's probably hate speech. And it's probably wrong in some societies. But the question is this. There are many societies that have democracies. And in these democracies, the freedom of speech is almost inviolate. It's so important. If you can't say what you want to say, how can you really say you're free? So what is the need to restrict speech, even if the speech is not exactly what we want to hear? What is that need exactly? And who has that need? Baron, what do you think? What's the need to restrict speech? Okay, maybe it can lead to crime. Maybe there's tons of negative social consequences, right? Anya?
Hey, it can lead to further discrimination. It in fact endangers a certain social group.
Okay, it's a danger to society. It can lead to further discrimination. It might even lead to tension and conflict between racial groups, right? So you've identified some key potential arguments, and I'm happy you're writing it down because it is relevant today. Some key potential arguments that you might be able to use today, mainly because a certain group has this particular need. What is this group? Or what particular target are we talking about in the hate speech debate?
Well, every race is subject to hate speech.
Okay, all races, all minority races?
Not necessarily.
Not even minorities, because in South Africa, you know, the minority was ruling it for quite a bit. The majority was suffering. Anything else? Not just races.
Gender.
Genders, okay. You can have a target gender, perhaps.
Yeah, sexuality.
Sexuality, that's correct. I have a lot of friends in San Francisco, for example, who would definitely support this motion. What else?
Religion.
Sorry?
Religion.
Religion, exactly. You have the case of Danish cartoons, for instance, where a lot of Muslims were very, very offended by what was printed in the Danish newspaper, and they thought that was hatred against Muslims. Helen?
Is it true that some of those were actually, that not all of the cartoons themselves were actually derogatory, or was just the depiction?
Yes,
With the
well,
picture of Prophet Muhammad.
here's the problem. It depends on your perspective. When I talk about the standard for this particular motion, perspective is very important, okay? Because if you're Danish and you see the cartoons, you'd be like, okay, so Muhammad has a bomb on his head. So what? We've seen cartoons of Jesus Christ doing crazy things.
No, but weren't some of them like, wasn't one of the problems like in the books is that people without Muhammad, but it's not the fact that it was, you know, that they had a bomb on his head.
Yeah, I haven't seen all the cartoons,
Wasn't it in the
so I
newspaper?
can't actually vouch for every single one. But yes, for the Western folk, I think it's not as offensive, perhaps. But for a lot of my Muslim friends, any of those pictures would be offensive for them, because it's the idea of depicting a holy man, a holy prophet, okay, in weird and almost vulgar ways. Vulgar meaning like commonplace, vulgar ways, okay, that they just really get upset about. Or even if you try to draw Allah, for example, you're not allowed to even depict Allah If you do that, that's a crime. And also, again, in terms of perspective, it depends on the type of Muslim we're talking about. Because some of them are a lot more fundamental and orthodox than others. So again, you still have that issue of standing. But see, if I'm going to go back to the whole concept of need, you've got to identify a target group here. It could be big, it could be society, it could be the world, if you will. But you have to identify a group. Because if you can't identify a group, how do you prove that there's a need? Exactly. Right? So once you identify a group, and once you identify a need, and you have to kind of show that the need is sufficiently urgent. Otherwise, there's no real reason for having a debate right now. Okay? You can say, oh, well, maybe in 700 years, this policy will be important, so let's do it now. Doesn't make any sense. You still need a plan after that. What do I mean by plan? You still have to have a practical way of achieving what you say are the needs of this target group. If you don't have that practical plan, you don't have the practical way, you're not going to be able to come up with a policy. So, here's a good example. Some people say, in this case, that the real need is to prevent racism. Okay? It's one of the needs that they identify. So what plan exactly are you going to be proposing to prevent racism? To make it a crime? What does that mean exactly? So you're going to ask some basic questions. For instance, who's going to do this? Is it the government? Why will they do it? Will they actually do it? Can they actually do it? And if you can't identify an actor, a particular group that does, not like Robert De Niro actor, but I mean a person or group that actually does something, if you can't identify that, then it's going to be difficult to prove that something can be done. For instance, if you have a policy like, this house believes that we should intervene in Sudan. Okay, you all know the issue there? Darfur, all of the problems happening there, the Janjaweed, etc. Who's going to do it?
Slovenian government is going to first.
The Slovenian government will intervene in Sudan. All 2 million people in Slovenia will suddenly go to Sudan and convince the Janjaweed not to do
our
it.
president went there, so...
Okay, the president of Slovenia. Maybe. Well, let's pretend that that's your actual plan. How workable is this? How much authority does he have, and how much capability would he have to actually prevent any kind of a conflict? All right. Matthew, any idea? Who might come into Sudan? Chuck Norris. Okay, you have these websites with Chuck Norris doing everything? No, seriously, who do you think? Give me an idea. The UN, maybe, right? Maybe. So you say the United Nations should come to Sudan. Now the first question is, can they?
Yes, depends.
Depends on what their mission is.
Depends on the mission, depends on whether they can identify it as genocide or not, whatever, right? So we have to get through those questions, right? But then, more importantly, will they?
No,
Why not?
because somebody will be against it, and because the United Nations has really, really bad experiences from the past with intervening in this kind of
Okay,
stuff.
maybe they're loath to actually come in because they had they had problems before, maybe in Somalia, issues in Kosovo, whatever, right?
China could come in as a mediator between like Sudan and the
Okay.
other countries.
What does that mean? Does that mean that the UN will do it, or that the UN will not do it if China comes in as a mediator?
But if the UN will do it, because actually like China has an influence in the UN, and UN, their goal is to solve like the genocide that is like happening in Darfur. And why China is like powerful is that actually China's having like the 2008 Beijing Olympics, right? And because China has a relationship with Sudan, and they're not saying anything about it.
Yep.
And some people came up and said that if China's just like ignoring the genocide that's happening, and they're thinking that they can have the Olympics, then
Okay.
we're not really going to support it. So China recently recognized it, and their president actually went there.
So in a nutshell, Anne, what do you think?
So they have the potential of actually solving it, because
So China has the potential to do
Yeah,
it.
because-
Does China have the political will to do it?
yeah,
No.
yeah, because
Okay, Helen says no, you say yes. Obviously, you're going to be on opposite sides of this debate, right?
but we're
Why do you say no?
I say no because first of all, China has a billion people to attend to, and they have their own needs and their own problems.
Okay.
Sudan, considering the fact that the United Nations it's in their charter that they want to prevent genocide, they want to prevent conflicts like this. Basically what's been happening is countries have been shrugging off this responsibility onto the UN.
And how will China stop the UN from doing anything?
China's not going to stop the UN from doing anything. It's that China themselves, in a unilateral effort,
Won't do
is
it.
not going to go into.
Okay. So that's, I'll add a further thought here. You heard about the UN Security Council. You heard about the permanent members. You heard about the veto issue with the permanent members. I think it was Article 27 that gives them that right of the UN Charter. If the opposition can prove that one of those countries will definitely veto, that's going to cause trouble for the plan. Right? This is what I'm talking about. In a policy debate, you have to cover all of these grounds. Because if the proposition says, oh yeah, the UN's going to do it, and the opposition has absolute, incontrovertible fact, maybe a news clipping that said China says, we will veto any UN action towards Sudan, then that pretty much kills the plan. So it's important to ask, not only can someone do it, but will they actually do it? Another question is, will the United States invade Iran? Okay. Can they invade Iran?
Yes. Yes,
They could, maybe, but then someone will question, no, they can't, because they have 150,000 plus troops in Iraq. They can't afford another war right away. So they can say that. Or they can say, will they?
Probably not.
Probably not. Americans, what do you think?
Again,
You think the public will support
not
another
in the
war?
current situation.
Not under the current situation, and maybe not under the current administration, right? So that's another example of things working with the plan or not working with the plan. Okay? A couple more things about the plan before we get to the benefits. Another aspect of the plan would be the resources involved. Do you have the financial resources? Do you have the human resources? Don't worry, I'm going to give you a handout later, but it's good to just think of these things right now. Do you have the equipment? Do you have the physical resources, the trees or whatever? It depends on the plan, but do you have those things? And then lastly, the timeline. Exactly when are we going to start this plan? Like if you say let's invade Iran or let's go into Sudan, when? And then more importantly, because as we've seen from the mistakes of Iraq, for how long? Because when they entered Iraq, guys, what did George Bush say? What did Donald Rumsfeld say? How long was that supposed to last?
Oh, it would be we'd waltz through there and then read it as liberators. And then
Liberators and-
establish democracy over
Would it take a year? The original
No.
plan? Maybe a year, maybe a couple. Would it take 6 years?
No.
Of course not. And if they had said that up in the original plan, oh, it's going to take 6 years and we're still not done, that would have affected the feasibility of that plan. That would have affected the whole debate. So now you see how these things are relevant in any kind of a policy. Okay? And then lastly, we have benefits. And when I say benefits, I mean net benefits. So I'm going to tackle this on 3 levels, okay? The concept of net benefits, the concept of something being better than the status quo, and the concept of something being the best alternative, okay? And please pay attention, this is important. Let's look at the concept of net benefits. Net benefits basically means if you weigh the benefits of one plan versus the liabilities or the costs of that particular plan, the benefits will outweigh clearly the costs and the liabilities. If there's no clear way of telling that something is more beneficial, the plan's probably not going to work. Your policy is probably not going to work. So you've got to be able to say that we're going to do this and it's really going to help. Okay? But the net benefits have to mean something for whom? The benefits have to mean something for whom? The target group. And here's another thing. And for those of you who took any civics classes and talk about like tax breaks, for example, I'll talk about that in a second. See, the target group you initially identify as the one having the need, that's the same target group that you should be helping with the benefits. Okay? Let's talk about tax breaks, for instance. The Republicans traditionally are anti-taxes, right? They try to lower taxes, they promise tax cuts, or read my lips, no new taxes, whatever, okay? Which, by the way, was a lie, but never mind. So, what happens, supposedly, when people cut taxes? For the income tax, for instance. What happens if they cut income tax, or they cut sales taxes, or any kind of tax? What will happen, generally?
People keep more money in their pocket.
People keep more money in their pocket. So the target group that's supposed to be benefited by this particular plan would be People in society in general. What if the Republicans announced before they did this tax plan, they want to benefit only the rich? Would a plan like that work? No. So they have to say it's going to benefit the poor, the middle class, and basically everybody. They're not even going to mention the rich. Just everybody. But then what are the actual effects of some of these recent tax cuts?
The rich are paying, the top 1% of the country is paying, much less than they're used to in taxes, and the bottom has been affected very little, if at all.
Because the actual net benefits, if you look at it, just bear with me for a second, it would be this. Think about it for a second. All these taxes that they take from everybody, these billions of dollars in taxes, they go where?
Social care.
They go to social services, they go to the government so the government can take care of the people better, right? If I'm a poor person, and I make, let's say, just for the sake of illustration, if I make only $1,000 a month, okay, just pretend, $1,000 a month, and let's say they take 5% of that. That means they take $50 from my income, right? So you give me a full tax break, I get $50 back. Woo, 50 bucks, great. Okay, a couple of nice meals in Church Street, you're done. Okay? But my kids go to public school. They get benefits there. I get some assistance from the government. I have certain programs. We have the Stafford Loans program, for instance. When you guys go to college, you can actually take loans out and go to a college and pay the loans back later at a much lower rate. All of these things. Even social services, healthcare. This needs money. Now what happens if a dude like Donald Trump, who makes $1 billion, let's pretend, and gets taxed supposedly at, say, 30%. What's 30% of $1 billion? $300 million. Now, even if you cut that in half, and he pays 15%, that means he saved $150 million that year. He saved $150 million. The dude that saved 50 bucks loses $150 million in potential services, okay, that they could be spent for the government. Do you see what I'm getting at here? Okay, and this is true. Warren Buffett, the second richest man in the world, dude is a great investor, just recently said he pays a lower tax rate than his secretary. He's worth over $30 billion and he pays a lower tax rate than his secretary who makes $60,000 a year. All because of these nice tax cuts. So you see what I'm getting at here? Who really benefits from this? That's what one side might say. Of course, this is a very simplistic analysis, don't get me wrong. There are many ways to look at it, but I'm just giving you an idea. If you say you've got a need, if you say you've got a target group, if you say you've got a plan to help this target group, you got to prove that the net benefits really help the target group. Because if the net benefits don't help the target group, they're not really benefits. And so the plan can be called into question. Okay? Any questions on this so far? All right. Now, the other two I promised. With regard to benefits versus the status quo, you've got to prove that the plan you have is better than the status quo. Because even if you prove there are benefits of doing something, if not doing anything would have given you more benefits, you shouldn't do anything. So that's important. And most teams do this. Most teams do this. The problem comes from the third thing, which is the best alternative scenario. Like you say, something is the best thing. Because if it's not, and there is a better alternative, okay, and if this better alternative is mutually exclusive from your plan, meaning you have to do this instead of this. If there is a better thing to do and you have to do it instead of this, a good opposition side is going to go counter plan. We think the status quo sucks, but we're not going to follow your plan. We're going to have a better plan. A plan that we have to do instead of your plan. That's why proposition teams have to be careful. You can't just come up with whatever plan you think you can prove right away. You have to start thinking, is there a better plan out there? Is there something that the opposition can hit us with? Because if your plan is better than the status quo, but not better than the opposition's counter plan, you might still lose the debate. Okay, so you might want to think about that. Are there any questions on this stage? So let's look at it in terms of the motion you're going to have today. This House believes that hate speech should be a crime. Let's just do this briefly. I mean, there are many ways of doing this. Let's just take one interpretation of this, okay? What is hate speech? What is hate speech?
Speech talking against a certain.
Okay, we talked about this. Speech targeting a particular group that incites hatred. Sorry, you can't use the same word to define the word. That incites feelings of anger, resentment, or other negative feelings or emotions towards that particular group. And why is that bad? Why should it be a crime?
Because it arouses anger, hatred in other people.
It arouses anger and hatred. You might want to be a bit more specific. You might want to be a bit more concrete.
Because we want to create a society that's acceptable.
Yes, or because it leads to crime. Someone you mentioned earlier, it leads to violence, leads to bad things. For example, Holocaust denial. Okay, someone's saying the Jewish people didn't suffer in World War II. What are you talking about? 6 million people? I don't believe that.
Right, what do you think a group of Jews would do to that person?
Yeah, basically they're gonna say, look, the Jewish people are just making it all up to gain sympathy from the world. We should destroy the Jewish people because they're liars. Something like that. That kind of speech. Okay? And people say that's dangerous because first of all, it's really painful. It's really painful. Like if your grandfather was killed in the Holocaust and someone's telling you that your grandfather didn't really die and you're making it up, that's gonna offend you. And secondly, if it gives rise to extra hatred or resentment against the Jewish people, it might actually make them more under threat. It might actually cause great danger for these people. So you want to prevent that, right? So you've identified a need, you've identified a particular target group, but you still have to prove that a particular plan will work. So when you say crime, some other aspects. What do you mean by crime exactly? How are you going to do this prosecution? How are you going to determine what is acceptable or unacceptable? You have to have a standard for choosing between hate speech and freedom of speech. Right? Those kinds of things are necessary. If you don't have a standard, how can you tell? So if someone says to another person, dude, I think you're ugly, and the person is of a different race, is that hate speech?
No.
Or is that honesty?
Honestly.
Right? If someone looks at me and says, dude, you got a bad haircut, is it because he hates Asian people? Or is it because I really had a bad haircut and I went to the wrong hair salon yesterday or the other day? Okay, is that so? Sorry, Debbie, you're a good hairstylist. So we have to start finding out ways to be able to determine whether something is or isn't acceptable. That's one of the things that we have to consider, and that's part of the plan. Okay? So in analyzing motions, let me just quickly wrap this up for these three things. Each of these different motions have different things you have to do. Okay? In fact motions, you got to be careful. Just because you have facts, it doesn't mean that a single fact will be able to make you win the debate. You have to be able to give a persuasive interpretation of the facts. You have to give a standard for deciding what that fact means. And that's the only way you can reach an acceptable conclusion in that debate. All right? For the second type of motion, we're talking about value motions. Especially in difficult debates where you have two seemingly good opposing values, you have to have a principle that combines with a target group. Because something is only worth something if it is worth something to that group. Otherwise, it's an empty principle. Okay? So you got to combine those two, and then again, you kind of make an interpretation of it and prove that your side wins. Third thing we've just done, so I'll just briefly go over it again. You have to show a need, you have to show a plan that works, and you have to show real net benefits for this target group in order to justify doing a particular action. And in some cases, especially in advanced debating, you might want to justify it in terms of being the best alternative. Because if there's something better, the opposition might just hijack the debate by doing a counter plan or a counter proposal. Okay, any questions so far? All right, now I'm going to take it to one more area. I'm going to erase this if everyone's done with it. Okay. I'm now going to talk to you about how your analysis of the motion will lead to certain tactics. Exactly what do you need to do, especially if you're proposition. How do you exactly go about doing this definition thingy, and how does it work? All right. Now I'm going to write a few things you shouldn't do. Okay? Everything else is acceptable in general, but there are things you shouldn't do. So these are called the grounds for challenging a definition. I'm going to do this quickly because James talked about it a little bit earlier. Okay? So in terms of the grounds for definition, a definition should not be a truism, a tautology, a time set, a place set, or wholly unreasonable. Okay? And it's very important to know this because, especially if you're proposition, because if you violate these rules, you're going to be in trouble. Not only will the judges not like it, your opponents will definitely not like it. And you might get into a messy definitional challenge, which James and I both suggest you not do. Okay? Let me just briefly go through these things to explain what you're not supposed to do, what kind of definition you're not supposed to have. A truism is basically fact. You're defining something that is factual, so it's impossible to oppose. We had a debate motion a long time ago. This House believes that the sun rises in the east. Now, naturally, that was a motion that was meant to be defined thematically. I'll talk about that in a second. Meaning, you don't define it literally. You think of the general idea behind it, and then come up with an issue that is important, right? But some dude in government in that tournament said, "Oh, cool! Great motion! We're gonna win!" So he comes out, "Ladies and gentlemen, this House believes that the sun rises in the east." Well, if you'll take a look outside, you'll notice that little ball of light there, we call the sun, is coming from the direction called the east, and we've got a compass to prove it. And we are here to prove to you that it's going to be there in the morning, and it's going to go down there to the west in the evening. And we challenge the opposition in this debate to prove otherwise. And the judge is like, "You idiots. What are you doing?" That's not what the debate was supposed to be about. It was meant to be like a nice little, nicely worded kind of thing. That's why we eliminated those kinds of motions in the future. Because those are too open, right? What that was supposed to mean was something like that maybe the future of the world's economy rests with China, for example, or somewhere in the east instead of the west, or maybe culture, maybe the leadership in the world, we now have to look in the east, something like that. But that was factual, so there's no way you can oppose it. And that's just not fair, really. Okay? Tautology. A tautology, James mentioned this, I'm just going to quickly re-mention this, is something which is self-proving. Okay? You have defined the term so that because of your definition, it is clear that you're going to win the debate. And there's just no real way to oppose this. For example, this House believes that we should legalize all drugs, which was a motion we had recently at the World Championships. That sounds tough, right? Ooh, all drugs? Cocaine? Methamphetamine hydrochloride? Heroin? Opium? All? It sounds difficult, right? Right? But what if you defined it this way? This House believes that we should legalize all drugs. By drugs, we mean any therapeutic medicine that is sold in a drugstore. Hence the word drug. And we should legalize all therapeutic helpful medicines. Is that fair?
No.
No. You just define something in such a way that it is basically impossible for the opposition side to win. It's not possible to oppose it. And it's really just not even a fair definition of the word drug itself. That's an example of tautology. Okay? A time set is when you decide to unnaturally restrict the debate only to a particular time in history. Okay? This House believes that we should walk to work. This House believes we should walk to work. Maybe that's an environmental topic. Maybe that's something about, not using cars and gasoline. And then their definition, ladies and gentlemen, this House believes we should walk to work. We set this debate in the early stages of cavemen because we think it's appropriate. And we think cavemen should walk to work because, riding on a landslide is not very safe. And trying to hitch a ride on a dinosaur is also not safe. So walking is the best way. I mean, come on, guys. It's not fair. You're restricting it unnaturally. It's only for a particular time that will help you. So clearly it's not a fair and reasonable debate. A play set does the exact same thing that a time set does, except that it limits it to a particular area or location. Okay? My Korean students know this. I give this example a lot, but it's my favorite example because I did it here in the US. We had a World Championship debate here, and our opponents were defining the motion, this House would open its doors to the world. Okay? open its doors to the world. This is how they define it. By open, this house we mean the United States of America. By open its doors, we mean relax immigration laws. So I thought, okay, all right, sounds all right. By the world, we mean Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. The Cuban and Haitian refugees in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. And we're like, excuse me? I actually gave a point of information twice. First one was just the Cuban and Haitian refugees in Guantanamo, Cuba, and nowhere else? And they said yes. And then second POI, just the 5,000 current Cuban and Haitian refugees in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and no other future Cuban and Haitian refugees ever? And they said yes. Proudly too. And I was like, no. Challenge definition, and they lost the debate because it's obviously really stupid. And the world is not that small. Okay? So you understand why that's wrong. It's generally wrong because people want to only limit it to a place where they think they have an advantage. Okay? Something like, this house believes we should speak Korean, and we'll limit it only to Korea. I mean, hello? Obviously, you're going to win that debate. Right? Lastly, wholly unreasonable. This is when you cannot justify any link from the motion to your definition. Right? And again, my students know this, but this is also my favorite example for this, and this happened here in the US. The motion was, this house believes that we should abolish Medicare. Okay? Now, for those of you who don't yet know, Medicare obviously, healthcare system, etc., etc. I'm not going to get too in-depth about it, but this is what the dude did. He comes up and he says, all right, well, what exactly is Medicare, ladies and gentlemen? Medicare is a system where young workers get taxed so that their money goes to pay for the health care for older people. And that's not fair, because what's going to happen is this. When the young people keep getting taxed and their money keeps going to the older people, they're going to get resentful. They're going to hate the older people. And the older people, when they found out the younger people aren't willing to be taxed to help them, are going to hate the young people. And when the older people and the younger people hate each other, there's going to be intergenerational warfare in America, ladies and gentlemen. And when there's intergenerational warfare in America, the enemies of America will realize it is weak. And when they think that America is weak, that's when they're going to attack with nuclear weapons, ladies and gentlemen, because they'll realize it's their best way to overthrow America. So, in order to prevent nuclear war, we think we should abolish Medicare. That was their definition.
He actually said
He actually said that in a real debate. I'm not joking. And he was proud of it too. Okay? Obviously that's pretty dumb. You have to be able to link something in a reasonable way. So for example, later in your hate speech debate, if you can't prove that something is hate speech, for example, spitting. I spit at you. That's hate speech. That should be a crime. I'm like, no, that's saliva. You've got to be able to somehow link the actual act or whatever to the actual words in the motion and prove that it's a reasonable link. Okay? Can't do this, it's not acceptable. Now, lastly, because I have a few minutes left. As long as it's not any of these, it's okay. But how do you make it okay? Or a little bit more than okay? Okay? The last thing I'm going to talk about is the point of view. Or POV. Here's a quick illustration. I'm going to write something on the board. You tell me what you think it means. Okay? Just tell me what words come out from your head. Okay? In honor of Vermont, Ben & Jerry's. What does Ben & Jerry's mean to you? Anybody?
Good food.
Good food? Okay. What else?
Factory tour.
Factory tour, where you get free ice cream and you see how everything works. What else? Sorry?
Oh, those things are so good.
Vermonster? Okay. Yeah, things I shouldn't be eating because I'm trying to lose weight, but whatever. So, what else? When you hear Ben & Jerry's, what words?
Papers.
Sorry?
Leaf papers.
Leaf papers? How do you spell that?
Leaf papers. Like
Oh.
L-E-A-F.
Yep. Peepers?
Yeah.
All right. And I might throw in the words delicious. fattening, although I'll put that a bit later, and sweet, etc., etc. Cold. Now, what I'm trying to get at is this. Companies that have certain products, they brand their products. They try to create an impression in the minds of the people listening. So when you hear Ferrari, red, fast, luxurious, hot, those kinds of things come out, right? Those things, this branding thing, is what the advertising world calls positioning, okay? It's what I call in debate creating a point of view. You have got to be able to create a value for your case, certain words that you associate with your case. So in analyzing the motion earlier, right, the way to do this would be, for example, using proper adjectives to create a need, like heinous crimes in Sudan, okay, or the people suffering, intense suffering, you know, those kinds of things. You're creating this mood, this image that will try to kind of persuade the audience and the judge to look at it in a certain way. So you can even ask biased questions when you try to create a point of view. For example, I won't use hate speech. I don't want to bias you guys. Let's use another topic. Anybody give me a topic? Any topic?
Human cloning
Human cloning. What about human cloning?
is a ban.
Okay, we should ban human cloning. Something like this. You can say, look, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to prove to you that human beings should never be the subjects of bad experimentation. Human beings should never be destroyed. Human beings' dignity should never have to be sacrificed for scientific progress. That kind of thing. You're using keywords. This is what pathos that James was talking about. You're creating a point of view. But see, the point of view is more than that. It's not just creating words using adjectives. It's about looking at it from a certain perspective. You have to choose the right perspective when you're doing this. Otherwise, your whole case might not be as strong as it could be.